Harriet Tubman, Chapter 2, The First Years. Like all other babies in the quarter, Harriet Ross cut her first teeth on a piece of pork rind. The rind was tied to a string, and the string hung around her neck. She learned to walk on the hard-packed earth outside the cabin, getting up, falling down, getting up again, a small naked creature who answered to the name of Minta or Minty. When she finally mastered the skill of walking, she began playing with the other small children. All of the little ones, too young to run errands, were placed under the care of a woman, so old she could no longer work. She was a fierce-looking old woman, head wrapped in a white bandana which she called a head rag. She sat crouched over on the doorstep of her cabin, sucking on an empty clay pipe. Though she was very old, she could still switch a small child with vigor, using a tough young shoot from a black gum tree to enforce obedience. She never let the children out of her sight, warning them of the creek where they might drown, cautioning them about the nearby woods where they might get lost, shooing them out of the cabins lest they burn themselves in the hot ashes in the fireplaces. The children were afraid of her. She was toothless, and she mumbled when she talked. The skin on her face was creased by 1,000 wrinkles. When she was in good humor, she told them stories about what she called the Middle Passage. The mumbling old voice evoked the clink of chains, the horror of thirst, the black smell of death, below deck in the hold of a slave ship. The children were too young to understand the meaning of the stories, and yet they were frightened, standing motionless, listening to her, and shivering even if the sun was hot. The mothers of these children worked in the fields. A few of them, like Old Rit, worked in or around the big house. Because the mothers were not at home, a family rarely ate together all at the same time. The grown-ups ate from the skillet or black iron pot in which the food was cooked. Some of them ate from tin plates, balanced on the knees, eating for the most part with their hands. The children were fed in a haphazard fashion, a bit of cornbread here, a scrap of pork there. Occasionally, they received a cup of milk, sometimes potatoes. When they were given cornmeal mush, it was poured into a large tray or trough. In winter, the trough was placed on the floor of the cookhouse. In summer, it was put outside on the ground. The small children came running from all directions, with oyster shells or piece of shingle to scoop up the mush. They swarmed around the trough of mush like so many little pigs. Harriet, like the rest of the children, learned quickly that he who ate the fastest got the most food. Yet they were always a little hungry, not starving, but with an emptiness inside them that was never quite assuaged. She learned other things too. On winter days, when the sun shone, she played on the south side of the cabin where it was warmer. On cold rainy days, she huddled in a corner of the big chimney in the cookhouse, watching the constant stirring of the big iron pots. In the summer, when the sun was blistering hot, she stayed on the north side of the cabin because it was cooler there. When Harriet was 2 years old, the whispering about freedom increased. In the quarter, at night, some of the slaves gathered together in the cabin that belonged to Ben, her father, and talked. It could hardly be called talking. It was conversation carried on under the breath, so that it was almost no sound at all. On the way to Ben's cabin, the slaves moved so quietly, so slowly, so stealthily, that they might have been part of the night itself. As they edged through the quarter, there was not even the soft sound of a bare foot on the hard-packed earth. Not even the sound of breathing, not a cough or a sneeze, nothing to indicate that a slave had left his own cabin and was paying a visit to another cabin. There was fear and uneasiness all over the South that year. Fear on both sides. The masters were afraid of the slaves. The slaves were afraid of the masters. Yet the slaves had to talk about this new and dreadful thing that had happened. Word of it seemed to have been carried by the wind, pushed along over the grapevines from Charleston, South Carolina, to Wilmington, Delaware, and on down the eastern shore of Maryland, down to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. It was discussed all through the South, in the slave cabins, in the big houses, whispered about, argued about at night, just as it was in Ben's cabin. They whispered about a man named Denmark Vesey. At first, they had only bits of information about him, scraps of the story, and they slowly pieced it together until they knew as much about him as the men who had tried and executed him. Denmark Vesey was a free Negro. He bought his freedom when he was 33. He had been a sailor. He could read and write. He was always reading the Bible. He told and retold the story of the children of Israel and how they escaped from bondage to a group of slaves who were his followers. He told them all that men were born equal. He said that it was degrading for a colored man to bow to a white man. Finally, he planned an insurrection in which he and his followers were to kill all the white people in Charleston, South Carolina, and free the slaves. Before the insurrection was to take place, he quoted from the book of Zechariah in the Old Testament. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken. He had 2 men who worked closely with him, who helped him make the homemade pikes that were used in the insurrection. These men were Peter Poyas and Mingo Harth. They kept lists of the names of Denmark's followers, of the places where ammunition was kept, places where there were horses, and the names of slaves who looked after horses. 2 days before this uprising was to take place, the plot was revealed. 131 slaves in and around Charleston were arrested. Denmark and the 34 others were hanged. None of them confessed. The story went that Peter Poyas said, "Die silent," when one of the slave conspirators appeared to be weakening under torture. In the quarter, at night, when they talked of Denmark, they said he had made life harder for the rest of them. They shivered even as they said it. It was no longer safe to walk along the roads at night, no longer safe to walk about the plantation where they lived at night. There were new laws now because of Denmark. The new laws took away what little freedom of movement they had had. A slave caught on the road alone without a pass would be whipped, not by the overseer or the master, but by any white man who happened to see him. They were not supposed to talk to each other. 2 slaves standing talking would be whipped. They might be plotting servile insurrection, those long, hard words that meant death to the master, death to the slave, too. They had to be careful which songs they sang. They could no longer sing that fiery song, Sound of Thunder in the chorus. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Night after night they slipped into each other's cabins and talked of the man Denmark Vesey, of freedom, of the children of Israel, and how they were led out of bondage. Inevitably, someone repeated the verse from Zechariah that Denmark had quoted. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and the city shall be taken. Then someone else voiced an objection. Things were indefinitely worse because of Denmark and all his plots and plans for freedom. They could not hold church meetings of their own anymore. It was now a crime to teach a slave to read or write. The master said that even a little learning made a slave discontented, unfit for a life of slavery. Old Rit did not like all this talk of freedom and of Denmark Vesey. She said that the master had promised to free her and Ben and the children when she died. There was the sound of hope in her voice, mixed with fear. Because the master might forget to write it down in his will. Even if he did write it down, some of the crops might turn out bad, or he might have extra heavy debts to pay, or there might be a new overseer who would not like her or Ben. Any of these things would mean that she and Ben would be sold, the children sold too, all of them scattered over the countryside. Like the rest of the slaves, she feared change. She liked this place where they lived. The older children worked on nearby farms, so they were still together as a family. True, the cabin was hot in the summer and filled with cold drafts in the winter, and the smoke from the fireplace half blinded them, but it was still a good place. It was their home. The summers were warm, and there were creeks and inlets and streams in the nearby woods where they could catch fish, surreptitiously, of course, because they weren't supposed to. Sometimes they even fished in the big Buckwater River, or set traps in the woods, and thus caught rabbits or squirrels and added a little variety to their food. After all, anyone would get tired of eating the same ash cake and fatback or herring day after day. The master thought well of her and of Ben. Ben was big, broad-shouldered, a valuable hand. He worked in the woods, felling trees. She sometimes teased him about his axe. He was as fond of it as though it were a person. He said it was just right. It fitted in his hands, almost worked by itself. Ben was such a good workman. The master had placed him in charge of the slaves who cut the timber. Ben sometimes went all the way to the bay, the Chesapeake, where the big logs were loaded on boats and sent to shipbuilders in Baltimore. Ever since the slaves started all this talk about Denmark Vesey, she had been uneasy, insecure. She worried about the children. They would never be really hers until they were free. Yet freedom was a dangerous thing to even think about. She wished the slaves would stop whispering about it all the same. But every night, before these whispered conversations came to an end, one of the bolder slaves spoke of Denmark Vesey, a voice pitched low, not much more than a murmuring in the firelit cabin. He talked about the slave who protested when Denmark had said that all men were equal. The slave had said, "But we are slaves." Denmark Vesey had said, "You deserve to be." Old Rit hated the silence that always fell over the cabin afterwards. A hush that spread, and the shadows on the walls seemed to deepen. It made her heart beat faster, made her catch her breath. In that same year, 1822, when Harriet was 2 years old, a 12-year-old boy living in Lexington, Massachusetts, bought his first book, a Latin dictionary, with his own money. He earned the money by picking huckleberries in his father's pasture and selling them in Boston. The boy's name was Theodore Parker. The Latin dictionary was the first of 13,000 volumes, which he would eventually buy and, at his death, bequeath to the Boston Public Library. Years later, Theodore Parker incurred the wrath of the pro-slavery forces in the country. He was called the Mad Parson, and he too eventually came to know Harriet Ross, but he knew her as Harriet Tubman. And that is the end of chapter 2.